She didn't scream when her tires popped. She just stood there in her designer boots, staring at the jagged strips of metal sticking out of the ground, then at me on my porch with my cup of coffee. She didn't know I'd been waiting for this exact moment. And neither did my cows, who stopped chewing just to watch the show. It all started with tracks. At first, I thought it was the delivery guy cutting through my pasture again, the one who claimed his GPS told him it was a shortcut. But then it kept happening. Every morning, deep ruts crisscrossed the same section of pasture, carving up the soft soil, flattening the grass, and spooking my goat. One of them, an older nanny named Myrtle, had stopped going near that section of the field altogether. I knew something was wrong when she wouldn't even take her morning feed near the tree line. The mystery was solved one morning just after sunrise. I was up early feeding the animals when I heard tires crunching over the gravel at the gate. Then, without so much as a honk or a wave, a white BMW SUV rolled right through the wooden gate and onto my land like it was a public highway. I stood there stunned, holding a bucket of oats in one hand and blinking as the SUV drove across the pasture, missing a grazing calf by less than 2 feet. I waved my arms. The driver braked hard, the tires skidding a little on the dewy grass. The window rolled down and there she was. Sunglasses, perfectly ironed blouse, and a frosty expression like she was late to brunch. She looked at me like I was the one trespassing. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She leaned out the window, that Karen smirk already forming, and said she was just using the shortcut. Apparently, she'd been doing it for weeks. I told her this was private land, that I had livestock and fences and signs up. She gave a dry laugh and pulled out her phone to show me a satellite image. "Look, see, that's my house, that's your pasture, and that's the quickest way to get to the exit gate. Why drive all the way around when this goes straight through?" I stared at her, unsure whether to be angry or impressed by the sheer boldness. I told her again this was not a public road, and that she was endangering my animals. She waved me off like I was a kid selling lemonade and drove on, her tires spinning slightly as she cut back across the far fence line. That evening, I put up a chain across the gate and a large, hand-painted sign, "Private property no through traffic." The next morning, the chain was on the ground and the sign snapped in two, lying like a broken bone near a fresh set of deep tire tracks. My heart started pounding, not just from the damage, but the message behind it. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was deliberate. Over the next few days, the tension grew. My neighbors started asking about the tire marks. A few said they'd seen a white SUV speeding down our rural road. One of the older ranchers chuckled and said, "That woman acts like she owns half the county." I asked him who she was, and he said, "Oh, that's Karen. HOA president. Got more opinions than sense." I hadn't even realized she lived in the nearby subdivision. Apparently, the HOA had been pushing for more access points around the neighborhood, and she'd taken it upon herself to create one, through my land. I tried the legal route, called the sheriff. He came by, looked around, and admitted it was technically trespassing, but unless she caused direct harm, he said it would be hard to push charges. He advised I gather evidence and maybe send a formal letter. I thanked him, but it felt like duct tape on a cracked dam. That night, I sat on my porch watching the moon rise over the hills. I thought about my granddad, who'd built that pasture fence by hand, post by post. He used to say, "People respect what they earn, not what they steal." I thought about Myrtle limping, about the busted gate, about the way Karen looked at me like I was an obstacle, not a person. The next morning, sure enough, she came barreling through again. This time, she had sunglasses on and a Starbucks in her hand. She didn't even slow down when she passed me. Just gave a slight wave like we were on a country tour. My goats scattered and a few chickens flapped into the air as her tires tore another line through my pasture. I'd had enough. I started by calling an old friend who worked as a property rights consultant. He confirmed what I already knew: no easement, no right-of-way, no legal basis. I wrote up a letter and mailed it certified. But I knew she'd ignore it. She didn't believe in consequences. That was her flaw. So I started planning. I set up trail cams disguised as bird feeders, pointing them at the usual entry and exit points. I documented every drive-through, date and time stamped. Then, I spent a long evening walking the path she always took, noting the dip near the creek bed, the small rise before the barn fence, the exact spot where her tires always seemed to spin. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I did want her to stop. And if a pair of punctured tires was the price of ignoring a dozen warnings, then so be it. I had just the thing. An old box of homemade spike strips, left over from the days when folks had to keep wild hogs from rooting under the fence line. Granddad's idea. Still sharp, still effective. I buried them carefully, just beneath the surface, and raked the dirt to make it look undisturbed. Then I sat on the porch and waited. Myrtle rested in the shade nearby, chewing slowly like she was waiting too. It didn't take long. That familiar hum of the BMW rolled up again, bold as brass. I watched it come around the bend, right over the gate and into the field like it always did. She didn't even hesitate. But the moment her front tires hit that hidden strip, the sound was unmistakable. Pop, hiss, grind. She slammed the brakes. The SUV skidded and jerked to a halt. She got out slowly, looking down in disbelief as the air hissed from her deflating tires. Then she looked up at me. I raised my mug and took a long, satisfied sip. Myrtle let out a loud bleat. The moment was perfect, and I knew this was just the beginning. After the spike incident, things should have quieted down. Any reasonable person would have taken it as a warning and found another route, one that didn't involve trespassing, damaged livestock fencing, or a very public tire blowout. But not Karen. No, she took it as a challenge. By the next morning, the rumor mill was already grinding. Word spread that I had booby-trapped my pasture, that I was a danger to the community, and that I needed to be reported to the authorities. Reported for what, exactly, no one could say. But that didn't stop Karen from making a scene. She gathered a few of her HOA loyalists and staged what looked like a suburban-style protest in front of my property line, complete with folding chairs, hand-painted signs, and two poodles in sweaters barking at passing tractors. They stayed there most of the morning, sipping iced tea and gossiping loud enough for my cows to hear. One sign read open access for all, which made no sense since this wasn't a public park or a community walking trail. This was my land, my pasture, and it wasn't a shortcut for anyone, especially someone who refused to knock or ask permission. I didn't go out to confront them. Instead, I set up a small folding table just inside my gate and placed a single item on top of it, a laminated copy of the county property map, with my boundaries clearly marked in red. No words, just facts. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw it. She called out to me that her husband was speaking to someone at the city office and that she'd prove this was a shared easement. I knew she was bluffing. The county records were clear. Still, I decided to take it a step further. I installed 2 more trail cams and aimed one directly at the driveway entry. The other pointed at the creek bend near the back fence, the one she always used to exit. I adjusted the sensitivity to catch movement and set it to send instant photo alerts to my phone. The next 2 days were quiet. No tire tracks, no SUVs. It was almost disappointing. I started to think maybe the point had finally gotten through. Then came the 3rd morning. A sudden alert pinged my phone at 6:30 in the morning. I opened the app and there it was. The BMW. Not just on my land but creeping along the back fence line like a snake slithering through tall grass. She had figured out where the spikes were and found a new route to avoid them. I stared at the screen for a long moment, more irritated than angry. The nerve of this woman. She had memorized my pasture and mapped a new path through it like she was plotting a mission. That afternoon, I walked the new route she had carved out. The grass was flattened in long winding arcs, hoof prints scattered as the animals had obviously fled. One of the calves was limping slightly. Not enough to call the vet yet, but it stirred something fierce in me. I didn't care about her SUV. I didn't care about the HOA drama. But my animals were off limits. That's where I drew the line. The next morning, I stood by the fence and watched as Karen pulled up in her freshly cleaned BMW. She paused for a second, then started to roll forward like nothing had happened. I stepped into her path. She stopped, lowered the window, and stared at me like I was the one causing the trouble. I told her plainly that this was her last warning. She said she'd be taking this up with the board and possibly with her lawyer. I told her the board had no power here, and her lawyer was welcome to walk through the pasture anytime, on foot. That was when she shifted gears. The charm faded. The entitlement sharpened. She leaned in close and said that I didn't know who I was dealing with. She had friends on the zoning committee. She had connections. She had influence. I said that was fine. I had cattle, and I was getting real tired of replacing fences. I watched her fume for a few seconds before she backed up and turned around. But I knew she wasn't finished. She was just regrouping. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was a typed complaint from the HOA claiming I was obstructing a community access path. The letter had no legal backing, no signature from a municipal authority, and no contact number other than the HOA office line. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. I called the county clerk's office and had them send me the official zoning record. Not only was my land not part of the HOA, but the subdivision Karen lived in was clearly marked as having no access easements across my pasture whatsoever. I made several copies of that document. I decided it was time to let Karen talk to someone she hadn't met yet. I called up Henry, a retired property lawyer who now volunteered with the local landowner coalition. He came over with a folder thicker than a phone book and helped me draft a formal cease and desist notice. We also filed a notice of trespass with the county records office and had it notarized. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was legally binding, and that mattered more. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't be deterred by paperwork alone. She didn't respect fences or facts. She respected force. Not violent force. Just immovable, undeniable resistance. That's when I started getting creative. If she was going to sneak through the pasture like it was her personal shortcut, then I'd just make it a lot less convenient. I began placing old hay bales in unpredictable spots. I moved a feeding trough across one of her known paths and let the goats take over the area. Then I parked my old tractor, the rusty green one that hadn't moved in 5 years, right at the bend near the creek. The moment her tires slipped on the muddy turn, she'd meet an immovable wall of steel and rust. And it worked. That same evening, the alert buzzed again. The camera showed her SUV coming in faster than usual, probably trying to beat the daylight. Then the photos showed a different story. Skid marks. A hard stop. Her getting out in heels, looking at the mud-caked tractor blocking her path. She stood there for almost 10 minutes, pacing back and forth. Then she turned and marched back to her car. The SUV reversed slowly, inching back through the pasture with its headlights off, defeated. I didn't say anything to her the next day when I saw her walking down the main road. She passed my property without looking in. But I noticed something interesting. She was holding her phone and taking photos of every sign, every fence, every animal. She was building a case. That much was clear. And I was just getting started. After weeks of her antics, I realized Karen wasn't just trying to use my land as a shortcut. She was trying to prove a point. She had made this into a power play, and she wasn't used to losing. But what she didn't realize was that I'd grown up on this land, and I knew how to win without throwing punches. I had time, patience, and a deep love for subtle revenge. While she was busy printing out maps and waving HOA papers like they were holy scripture, I was preparing something she couldn't bluff her way through. I spent a full evening going through the footage from my trail cams. Dozens of clips showed her weaving through the pasture, often during early mornings or just before sunset. She always took the same entrance point, made a slow curve past the old oak, and exited near the creek bend. Her driving pattern was precise, almost rehearsed. That gave me an idea. If she was that predictable, then I could make her pay for it without even being there. The first thing I did was install a proper motion sensor system with instant alerts. These weren't your average doorbell cameras. These were hunting-grade, night vision equipped, and they were hidden in spots even I forgot about a day later. Then I set up solar-powered floodlights pointed at the key entry areas. Not to blind her, just to catch her by surprise. It's amazing what people will do when they think no one's watching. But it's even more amazing what they won't do when they know someone is. Next, I returned to that box of old farm supplies tucked in my granddad's workshop. It was mostly rusted tools and half-used rolls of barbed wire, but at the bottom was what I was looking for. Steel strips from old fencing with nail-like spikes welded across the top. They weren't long enough to hurt anyone badly, but they'd go through a tire like butter. I cleaned off the worst of the rust and spent the next morning burying them in her favorite route, just under the surface, spaced evenly. I didn't make them obvious. The dirt was smoothed over, the grass gently patted down. It looked like any other stretch of land. That evening I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the sky turn orange. I wasn't hoping she'd come through. I was expecting it. Just as the sun dipped below the ridge, my phone buzzed. The motion alert flashed. I opened the app and watched as her headlights appeared in the distance. She entered exactly where I thought she would. Moved with the same rhythm. Same arrogance. And then the SUV jolted, once, twice. The sound of tires bursting echoed through the quiet air, followed by a screech of brakes and a string of muffled shouting. I didn't even need to step off the porch. I could see her pacing from where I sat. She stood beside her now immobile vehicle, phone to her ear, stomping the ground like a child who had dropped her ice cream cone. I took a long, slow sip and leaned back in the chair. It wasn't just about the tires. It was about sending the message she refused to hear in plain English. You don't own what you didn't earn. But that night didn't end with pop tires. A few hours later, the sheriff's truck pulled into my driveway. Same deputy as before. Nice guy. Looked tired. He knocked on the door and asked if I knew anything about the incident. I didn't lie. I told him she had been warned multiple times. I showed him the footage. I handed him the notarized trespass notice. He nodded, clearly annoyed that he was being pulled into another one of Karen's games. Said she was demanding I be charged with property sabotage. But since she had no legal right to be on my land in the first place, he said it was hard to charge someone for defending their own space. She didn't take that well. The next morning, I found her SUV parked across the road with a hand-painted sign leaning against it. It read, "Beware dangerous property," and listed my address. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to humiliate me. Problem was, everyone in the area already knew her reputation. So instead of siding with her, most folks drove by honking their horns and waving at me in support. One even brought me a plate of homemade pie and told me to keep up the good work. Turns out, I wasn't the only one she'd been bothering. That afternoon, I got a call from my cousin Dean. He's a retired land surveyor with a wicked sense of humor and no tolerance for nonsense. I told him everything. He laughed for a full minute before offering to come over with his gear and help me settle things for good. When he arrived, we walked the property line together, marking every legal border and recording GPS coordinate. Then we drafted a formal map with legal notations, sealed and ready to be submitted if she tried any more legal stunt. The funny part was, Dean found something interesting while surveying. A few feet beyond the usual shortcut path, he discovered that Karen's property line didn't actually extend as far as she claimed. In fact, her own back fence had been built several feet into someone else's buffer zone. Suddenly her big HOA authority image looked a lot more fragile. The following day, Karen showed up again. This time on foot. She marched up to the gate like she owned the road and shouted my name. I walked out slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. She demanded to know if I'd damaged her tires intentionally. I asked her why she was on my land again, despite everything. She said she had rights. I told her no, she had habits. Bad ones. She threatened to sue. I nodded and handed her a copy of the survey and legal zoning documents. She barely glanced at them before ripping the paper in half and storming off, muttering something about small-minded farmers. I figured that might be the last straw for her, but I was wrong again. Later that week, I started noticing a car parked at the corner of the pasture every evening. Someone with binoculars, watching, taking notes. Karen had sent someone to gather evidence, likely for a lawsuit or HOA meeting. That's when I decided to add a little theater to the whole thing. I placed several signs along the fence, each one stating the exact legal code for trespassing, with added phrases like violators will be recorded and prosecuted. I made sure to walk the edge of the pasture twice a day with a clipboard and a camera strapped to my chest, narrating everything out loud like I was filming a documentary. The binocular guy didn't last long after that. He left after 3 days, never returned. But Karen wasn't done. Not even close. She was preparing something. I could feel it. The pressure had shifted. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was planning. And that meant I had to plan harder. The quiet didn't last. After a week of no sightings, no flattened grass paths, no new ruts in the soil, I had a gut feeling Karen wasn't giving up. She was just circling. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then, on a breezy Friday afternoon, it happened. I was filling the water troughs near the east pasture when I heard it. That awful grinding sound of rubber tearing against metal, followed by a screech and a long hiss. I dropped the hose and turned toward the sound. There, just beyond the barn, was the white BMW, lopsided with 2 tires completely flat and a furious woman in heels standing beside it. Karen had returned, and she had rolled directly into the second set of spikes. I walked up slowly, not rushing, because I knew better than to approach a Karen mid-eruption. She was already yelling into her phone, pacing in tight circles like a tethered goat. When she saw me, she pointed and screamed that I had gone too far. That this was premeditated sabotage. That she had a lawyer on the way and this time, she was going to make sure I paid. I didn't say anything. I just pointed up at the camera mounted discreetly on the tree. She followed my finger and froze. The realization hit her like a gust of wind. Everything she had done, everything she was about to claim, was already recorded. Still, she wasn't backing down. The deputy showed up again, same one as before, looking more tired than usual. He took one look at the scene, one look at me, then sighed like this was the last thing he wanted to deal with on a Friday. Karen launched into her speech, claiming I had intentionally created dangerous conditions on what she still insisted was a community access road. The deputy asked if she had any documentation to support that. She produced a crumpled printout of an online map and some HOA pamphlet. He asked if she had been informed to stay off the property. I handed him a stack of paperwork including the notarized trespass notice, the certified letter she signed for, and the county survey map. He skimmed the papers, then turned to Karen and calmly explained that she was not only in violation of private property laws but that she could be held liable for any damage her vehicle had caused to my land. That shut her up for a moment. She turned red, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might snap her own teeth. Then she muttered that she'd take this to someone who actually had authority and stormed off on foot, leaving her car sitting there like a monument to bad decisions. Later that evening, I got a knock at the door. A local reporter stood on my porch, holding a microphone and a big smile. She had heard about the so-called Pasture vigilante and wanted to know if I'd like to share my side of the story. I wasn't interested in attention, but she promised fairness. So I gave her a brief interview, explaining how Karen had repeatedly trespassed, ignored all warnings, and endangered my livestock. I even let her see the trail cam footage and the tire marks that cut through the grazing field like scars. She thanked me, packed up, and left. By Monday morning, the story was online. The headline read Pasture Vigilante Stands Ground Against HOA Queen. The article painted a clear picture, and the comments section exploded. Most people were on my side, laughing at the absurdity of someone trying to force their way through private farmland just to save 2 minutes on a drive. A few called me a hero. One person even offered to send me homemade spike strips as a gift. I didn't accept them, but it was still amusing. Karen, however, was not amused. She showed up that afternoon with a folder in her hand and 3 people in tow. 2 were HOA board members, and 1 looked like a lawyer, or at least someone who dressed like one. They stood on the edge of my property and shouted my name. I walked out slowly, nodding politely. Karen held up the folder and declared that they were filing for an emergency injunction to prevent me from installing any more so-called trap. I asked what court they had filed with. She didn't answer directly. The man next to her muttered that they were in the process of consulting municipal records and reviewing property right. I offered them copies of the county map and survey. Karen snatched the paper and tore it in half again. Some habits don't change. That night, I hosted a small get-together. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors who'd been curious about all the drama and had taken my side in recent days. We grilled some food, shared a few drinks, and watched the sunset over the pasture. I gave them a quick tour and showed them where Karen's SUV had been stranded, where she had cut through repeatedly, and where the new fences were going in. They laughed, shook their heads, and promised to back me if this went any further. One of them, an old farmer named Roy, said he had dealt with folks like her before. They didn't want peace. They wanted obedience. The next morning, I noticed a new sign in front of the HOA clubhouse. Emergency meeting tonight, all residents urged to attend. I wasn't invited, of course, but word travels fast in small towns. That night, I heard from 3 different sources that Karen had tried to spin the entire situation as a personal attack, a war on community values. But her own board members had grown tired of the chaos. One of them, a woman named Elise, stood up and asked why she had been sneaking through someone else's property in the first place. When Karen tried to blame vague road access laws, Elise pulled out a copy of the very article that had gone viral and asked how that helped the HOA's reputation. No one had an answer. The meeting ended with whispers, glares, and for the first time in weeks, Karen left without saying a word. I knew she wasn't done. Not completely. People like her don't fade out quietly. But for the moment, the road was empty. The pasture was still. The goats were grazing calmly. And I stood on the porch once again, sipping coffee and watching the horizon, knowing full well this wasn't the end of the story. Just the part where the storm loses its roar and waits to regroup. I didn't know what her next move would be. But I had a feeling it was going to be loud, legal, and just as ridiculous as everything she had done before. And I was ready for it. The quiet after the emergency HOA meeting didn't last long. 2 days later, a large manila envelope landed on my doorstep, hand-delivered by a courier wearing a suit too clean for a rural road. Inside was a cease and desist letter written in the most dramatic legal language money could buy. It claimed I was creating dangerous conditions on land being used as an unofficial public access route and that my actions had caused emotional distress and financial damages. It was laughable. The letter made it sound like I had turned my pasture into a war zone, when in reality, all I had done was protect my land from someone who kept pretending fences didn't apply to her. I handed the whole packet over to Henry, the retired lawyer who'd been helping me since the beginning. He read through it twice without saying a word, then leaned back and chuckled. He said it was all bark and no bite. Nothing in the letter had any legal ground, especially since Karen still had no documented easement or right-of-way through my pasture. He said I could either ignore it or respond formally with my own lawyered-up version. I chose the latter. If Karen wanted to play games, I'd give her rules she couldn't twist. While Henry prepared the response, I turned my attention back to the land. It was time to go from defense to deterrence. I bought a batch of solar-powered motion lights and placed them along the edge of the pasture, time to turn on with the smallest bit of movement. I also installed metal posts at key points in the ground, sticking up just enough to discourage vehicles but not enough to hurt anyone on foot. Subtle changes, but ones that sent a clear message. You are not welcome to drive here. I also made a new sign. It wasn't angry or threatening, just simple. Private property recorded surveillance, no vehicle access under any circumstances. I added a phone number for legal inquiries and had it professionally printed. It went right on the front gate, bolted in with steel screws and backed with a floodlight. Karen wouldn't be able to ignore it unless she closed her eyes on purpose. Then, just when I thought she might finally retreat, she escalated. She hired a land surveyor. I saw the guy one morning walking the property line with a tablet in hand and a puzzled look on his face. I walked over, introduced myself, and asked what he was doing. He said he had been hired to verify an easement. I asked him to show the paperwork. He hesitated, then admitted he hadn't been provided any, just vague instructions and a pin drop location on a GPS app. I offered him water and showed him the official county survey from Dean. Within 15 minutes, he confirmed that not only was there no easement, but Karen's back fence extended 3 feet beyond her actual property line. He left quietly, thanking me for being civil. The next day, Karen drove up and parked outside my gate again. She didn't come in this time. She just sat in her car for a long while, staring through the windshield like she was trying to memorize everything. I didn't wave. I didn't move. I stood in the pasture near the goats, letting her see me standing firm. Eventually, she backed up and drove away. But I knew something new was coming. Her silence was always the loudest warning. 2 days later, I found out exactly what she had been planning. A local contractor stopped by unexpectedly and asked if I was the one requesting to clear a new path for emergency access through my back field. I said absolutely not. He showed me a printout with my property marked and a request form signed with my name, but the signature wasn't mine. Karen had forged a request to create a fake access lane. The contractor had gotten suspicious because the name and number listed weren't matching up when he tried to confirm the job. I was furious, but more than that, I was impressed by how far she was willing to go. I filed a report that afternoon with the sheriff. Forging a signature on a land modification request was serious, and I had every intention of seeing it through. Henry helped me document everything, and within 48 hours, the sheriff paid Karen a visit. I don't know exactly what was said, but neighbors reported raised voices, and one woman said Karen was shouting about slander and legal harassment. It was almost funny until I remembered how much time and money I'd wasted just trying to protect something that should never have been threatened in the first place. Not long after that, another HOA meeting was called, this time not by Karen. Word spread that several board members had grown tired of the drama and wanted her removed as president. The vote was scheduled for the weekend. I wasn't allowed to attend, obviously, but the turnout was bigger than usual. People brought lawn chairs and popcorn like it was a community movie night. When the vote was counted, Karen was out, replaced by a woman named Elise, the same board member who had called her out weeks ago. Elise sent me a handwritten note the next day, apologizing for the trouble and assuring me the HOA would no longer interfere with anything beyond its borders. It should have ended there, but Karen had one more stunt to pull. That weekend, I woke to find someone had tossed a bag of nails and broken glass near the pasture entrance. Not in the pasture itself, just outside the gate where my truck usually passed. I saw it before I drove over it, luckily. I checked the trail cam and caught a blurry image of someone in a hoodie late at night, sneaking toward the fence. The figure was too small to be Karen, but the timing and intent were clear. She was trying to get even in the pettiest way possible. I didn't report it. I just cleaned it up, reinforced the gate, and added one more camera. Then I took my old wooden cart and filled it with pumpkins from the garden, stacking them high and bright right by the road. I put up a new sign beside it. Fresh pumpkins free to good neighbors. It wasn't a trap. It was a reminder that kindness lives next door to consequences. And the people who know the difference don't need signs to figure it out. That night, I sat under the porch light, coffee in hand, and listened to the crickets sing over a field finally untouched. The air was still. The soil was whole. And for the first time in a long while, the only tracks in the pasture were from hooves and boots, not arrogance and rubber. Whatever Karen tried next, I'd be ready. Because now she knew what I already did. That land isn't something you conquer. It's something you earn the right to walk on. And when you don't, it pushes back. The letter came with a stamp from the county courthouse, and was hand-delivered by a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He apologized as he handed it over and said with a wince that Karen had officially filed a small claims suit. According to the paperwork, she was seeking damages for the popped tires, emotional distress, public embarrassment, and something she had labeled Pasture sabotage. It was absurd from the first line to the last, but it was real, and it meant I'd have to step into a courtroom and sit across from someone who had spent months pretending my land was her personal driveway. Henry nearly spit out his coffee when I showed him the papers. He laughed so hard he had to sit down and wipe his glasses. Then he got to work. We prepared everything with care, making sure every warning I'd given her, every notice sent, every photo from the trail cams was printed, dated, and placed in a thick binder. We included statements from neighbors, the surveyor's report, even copies of the contractor's complaint about the forged request form. Henry said we weren't just building a defense. We were building a wall of facts she wouldn't be able to climb over or dig under. Court day came faster than I expected. It wasn't a grand courtroom like you see in movies. Just a small, dusty room in the county building with squeaky chairs and a judge who looked like she'd heard enough nonsense to last a lifetime. Karen walked and dressed like she was hosting a charity gala. Pearls, heels, the works. She carried a stack of disorganized papers and flopped them onto her table with theatrical flair. Her lawyer, a thin man who looked as though he'd rather be golfing, barely acknowledged her as he shuffled through the documents. The judge started with a simple question. Did Karen have any documented right to access my land for any purpose? Her lawyer cleared his throat and began referencing old maps, printouts from online, and something about historic usage. The judge raised a hand and asked again if there was a legal easement or right-of-way. Karen jumped in, claiming she had been using the path for years, that it was the most logical route, and that I had only started complaining after a personal grudge. The judge interrupted and asked if she had ever been granted permission to use the land, formally or informally. Karen stammered, then looked at her lawyer, who simply said no. Henry stood and presented our binder. He walked the judge through every warning letter, the trespass notice, the survey results, and the video stills showing her repeated trespass even after being notified. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The evidence did all the shouting. Karen's expression changed as the judge flipped through the binder. At first she looked bored, then confused, and finally irritated. When Henry brought up the forged contractor request, Karen's lawyer whispered something and shot her a look that suggested he was regretting taking the case. The judge sat back and exhaled through her nose. Then she looked at Karen and told her that she was not only in the wrong, but dangerously close to facing charges of her own if she continued to abuse public offices and forge requests. She dismissed the case, ruled in my favor, and added that Karen would be responsible for my court costs and damages to the property, including fence repair and vet expenses for the injured calf. Karen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even argue. She just sat there frozen, eyes wide, lips tight, like someone who had forgotten what losing felt like. When the hearing ended, she stood up and walked out without a word. Her lawyer followed a step behind, not even bothering to pack her papers. I thought that would be the end. I really did. But I underestimated how hard it is for someone like her to accept public defeat. A few days later, I got word that Karen had filed an appeal. It was quickly rejected by the clerk's office for lack of standing, but the fact that she tried meant she still wasn't ready to let go. Then came the most unexpected twist of all. The HOA board called a special vote. Turns out Karen's legal drama had embarrassed the entire neighborhood. Her own neighbors had finally had enough of the bad press and the late-night shouting matches on her driveway. During the vote, which I was told was nearly unanimous, she was removed not just as president but from the board entirely. Her access to community meetings was suspended, and a formal letter was posted in the HOA newsletter citing misuse of power and harassment of a non-HOA landowner. The new president, Elise, stopped by my place a few days later. She brought cookies and a hand-signed letter from the board apologizing for the months of conflict. She said they'd be doing a better job of separating HOA matters from personal vendettas going forward. I thanked her, though I didn't eat the cookies. I gave those to the goat. Karen had made me too cautious for neighborly baked goods. After that, life began to settle. The pasture healed. The animals calmed. Even the grass seemed to grow greener, as if it too was relieved. I fixed the fences properly this time, reinforcing the old wooden posts with new ones made of steel and cement. I installed a swinging gate with a numeric lock, not because I thought Karen would return, but because I believed in never leaving the door cracked for nonsense to sneak back in. A week later, I saw the for sale sign go up in front of Karen's house. A clean white sign with a fancy realtor logo, and the words private showings only. Rumor was she was moving back to the city. Something about too many people around here lacking class. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just watched as the sign swayed gently in the breeze and thought about how far we had come from a set of tire tracks in the dirt. I went back to my routine. Feeding the animals. Mending the land. Sitting on the porch in the evenings with a mug in hand, watching the horizon. And when the cows looked up or the goats bleated softly, I'd nod and smile because they understood something most people didn't. That some battles aren't won by shouting or suing or showing off. They're won by standing your ground, one quiet step at a time, until the noise gives up and walks away. And though I didn't expect peace to last forever, I was content knowing that when trouble came again, it would find a man with patience, a pasture with boundaries, and a history of letting the land speak louder than any courtroom. The days that followed were calm in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like it's holding its breath, but instead settles deep into the soil and stays there. No more tire tracks across the pasture. No more headlights cutting through the morning mist. No more shrieking voices echoing across the fence line like a badly tuned wind chime. The land was finally at peace, and so was I. The animals moved freely again, especially the older ones who had been spooked so often they had started avoiding certain corners of the field. Myrtle, the old goat who had once been the most timid of the herd, began lying in the sun near the old oak tree again, her ears flicking lazily as if all was right in the world. I kept to my usual routines but with more ease now. I started repairing the parts of the land I had neglected while dealing with Karen's chaos. The fence posts were replaced one by one, this time reinforced deeper into the ground. I laid gravel over the muddy section of the main trail to keep the tractors from getting stuck after rain. I even reseeded parts of the pasture that had been torn up by her tires. Slowly but surely, I took my land back not with anger, but with care. Then came something I hadn't expected at all. A small envelope arrived one morning, tucked into the mailbox between a feed catalog and an electric bill. No return address, no stamp. Just my name in neat handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photo. The photo showed Karen's BMW, clearly dented and scratched, parked awkwardly on a flatbed tow truck. The paper was a short note. It said she had sold the car and moved to her sister's house in another county. That she had underestimated how much damage pride could do. There was no apology. No request for forgiveness. Just a quiet end to a very loud chapter. I folded the note and tucked it away in the back of my desk drawer. Not out of sentiment but because something in it felt final. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was the closest thing I was going to get. A few days later, I held a small gathering for some neighbors. Nothing big. Just a few folks who had stood by me when it mattered, the ones who had watched the circus unfold and still offered a smile and a helping hand. We grilled some meat, served fresh corn from the garden, and told stories until the sun dropped behind the hills. No one mentioned Karen. There was no need. Her absence was the loudest presence in the room. That evening, as the last of the guests left, I walked out to the pasture and stood by the fence, looking out over the land that had taught me more about boundaries than any courtroom ever could. The stars were just starting to appear, faint and scattered, like the first signs of peace after a long storm. I breathed it in, the scent of earth and grass and something else that felt like freedom. The kind that's earned, not handed over. The next week, I decided to take things a step further. Not just maintaining the land, but adding something to it. I converted the old toolshed by the gate into a small produce stand. Nothing fancy. Just shelves for fresh eggs, garden vegetables, and jars of honey from a neighbor down the road. I put up a chalkboard sign that said "Honor System, take what you need, leave what you can." The stand became a small but steady success. Locals stopped by, tourists on country drives pulled in, and even kids from the subdivision came with their parents to pick out pumpkins in the fall. People started associating my land with something good again. Not conflict or court cases or ridiculous HOA drama, but something real, honest, kind. That's what I had wanted all along. Not revenge. Not spectacle. Just a return to peace and the right to protect it. One morning, as I restocked the eggs, a young woman pulled up and stepped out of her car. She smiled and said her grandmother used to tell her stories about a man who defended his pasture like a castle and that she had wanted to come see it herself. I laughed and told her the castle part was an exaggeration, but she was welcome to look around. It hit me later that day how much had changed. Not just on the surface but in the way the community had shifted. Where once there was tension and suspicion, there was now something closer to unity. Karen had tried to divide people through control and entitlement, but what she ended up doing was the opposite. She reminded everyone what happens when you ignore respect and think rules don't apply. In the end, she united the neighborhood more than she ever had as HOA president. I knew better than to believe that peace was permanent. Something else would come along eventually. Another neighbor with a loud opinion or a complaint about livestock noises or a dispute over property lines. That's just how life worked out here. But I also knew I'd be ready. Not just with spike strips or paperwork, but with the calm that comes from standing your ground once and knowing you can do it again. A few months passed. The pasture grew thick and green, and the garden bloomed like it was proud of me. I added a new gate at the far end of the field with a keypad lock, just in case. But mostly, I spent my time doing what I had always done. Fixing fences, feeding animals, watching the sky shift from blue to orange and back again. One evening, just as the sun dipped low, I saw a small group of kids walking by the edge of the road. They pointed at the honor stand, then at the goats in the pasture. One of them asked if the goats had names. I told them they did. One pointed at Myrtle and said that one looked like she'd been through something. I smiled and said she had, and she'd come out stronger for it. Just like the land. Just like me.